Now in our 25th year, a quarter of a century of service to the worldwide amateur radio community, we are This Week in Amateur Radio, your all-amateur radio and technology news magazine and bulletin service of the air. This is edition number 1318 with a release and air date of Saturday, June 1st, 2024. Please take the program to your air following the cue tone.
On the air on the amateur bands around the world, and streaming on platforms across the internet, we are This Week in Amateur Radio. We are the worldwide premier amateur radio and technology news magazine and bulletin service of the air. Here are the stories for release around the earth as we come to air with edition number 1318 of This Week in Amateur Radio. The ARRL Volunteer Examiner Coordinator Services update during the current league services outage. Solar activity recently has been significantly affecting the ionosphere and propagation. We will have an in-depth look. The FCC opens a comment period about how the recent solar storms affected communications. An engineer who developed an innovative antenna design is suing his ex-employer over the antenna's potential military applications. We will have this amateur's story. We will have the results of the recent ARRL section manager elections. The ARRL Foundation has announced the return of the Club Grant Program for 2024. CQ Magazine 2024 Amateur Radio Hall of Fame inductees are announced. Meanwhile, the Orlando Hamcation is opening the nomination period for its 2025 awards. AMSAT Project Oscar discontinues operations and donates its remaining funds to AMSAT. WWVB is operating at reduced power while it repairs a windstorm-damaged antenna. Field Day 2024 is now less than a month away. We will tell you how to find a field day operation near you. And, with the ham radio exemption now in place in Pennsylvania, does it also cover operating CW Mobile? If you own certain vehicles from certain manufacturers, they already have CW. We will tell you all about it in this week's report. These headline stories will come to you in a moment, along with this week's special features. We'll visit with Bruce Page, KK5DO, and get an update from AMSAT and what's new with all those amateur satellites in orbit. Australia's own Anno Benchop, VK6FLAB, and Foundations of Amateur Radio will discuss the origins of our amateur radio bands. Our own amateur radio historian, Bill Continelli, W2XOY returns with another edition of the Ancient Amateur Archives. This week, Bill takes us aboard the Wayback Machine to explore the history of amateur radio repeaters in part 2 of this special report. We will stop by and visit with Bill Saliers, at J8B in the DX Corner, with all the latest news on DXpeditions, DX, upcoming contests, and more. And, from the just concluded Dayton Hamvention, we will hear a talk given by Riley Hollingsworth, K4ZDH, a ARRL Volunteer Monitor Program Administrator, at the 2024 Dayton Hamvention during the Good Operators and Interference Forum. That's all straight ahead as North America's premier amateur radio and technology news magazine and bulletin service, This Week in Amateur Radio, takes to the air right now. Reporting from our headquarters studio, in the sunny suburbs surrounding Albany, New York, this is W2XBS.
And reporting from our news bureau in Salem, Ohio, this is Denny Haight, NZ8D.
And reporting from our news bureau in Rochester, New York, along the southern shore of Lake Ontario, I'm Dave Wilson, WA2HOY.
And reporting from our Troy, New York news bureau, where we had a terrific week of weather, I'm Eric, KD2. RJX.
And reporting from our news bureau in western Massachusetts, where the maple syrup flows like rain and the moose occasionally show up at town hall meetings. I'm Marvin Turner, W0MET.
And reporting from our amateur radio outpost in the Catskill Mountains of upstate New York, where their newly planted corn is already up about 4 inches, I'm Don Hulick, K2ATJ.
And reporting from our news bureau in Fayetteville, Arkansas, where our neighbors just north of us are recovering from the effects of many tornadoes that roared through on Memorial Day weekend, I'm Will Rogers, K5WLR.
And now, as our lead story, here is Denny Haight, NZ8D.
Leading off our news this week, ARRL previously reported that they are responding to a serious incident involving access to their network and headquarters-based systems. Several services have been affected, including those administered by the ARRL Volunteer Examiner Coordinator. ARRL volunteer examiners should continue to submit exam registrations and material requests. While they are unable to post new or revised exam session dates and details to the website, they can ship out exam materials. Please remember that most exam materials are available on the League website. The ARRL has now resumed the process of amateur radio license applications with the FCC. This includes applications for new and upgrade licenses, individual applications, and club license applications. Exam sessions will be submitted to the FCC in chronological order from earliest test dates to the latest. Please allow additional time for their processing as the exam session backlog is cleared. ARRL is currently unable to create international amateur radio permits, license class certificates, and volunteer examiner badges, certificates, and stickers. New ARRL VE applications and renewals are unable to be processed at this time. Concerning the ARRL Youth Licensing Grant Program and the FCC application fee reimbursement, the ARRL is continuing to accept reimbursement forms to cover the one-time $35 application fee for new licensed candidates younger than 18 years of age for tests administered under the auspices of the ARRL VEC. Reimbursement checks may take longer than normal to be processed at this time. The ARRL VEC cannot be reached by telephone at this time. There has been no interruption to visitor operating at W1AW, the Hiram Percy Maxim Memorial Station. The station resumed voice bulletins on Thursday, May 23rd. All other scheduled transmissions, including Morse code practice and code and digital bulletins, have resumed on Thursday, May 30th. Please refer to the regular operating schedule on the League's website. After last week's distribution of the ARRL letter, the newsletter service has resumed. Current editions of ARRL Club News and the Aries letter have also been distributed. ARRL store orders have resumed shipping. Orders are being fulfilled from the earliest order dates to the latest. Please allow additional time for processing. There has been no disruption to the ARRL.net email forwarding service, though forwarding email addresses and aliases cannot be modified at this time. And finally, the telephone system at the League is unavailable at this time. We will have further updates as they become available. We appreciate your patience as the ARRL continues to work on restoring access to affected systems and services.
The sun has been busy, and it's been a mixed bag for radio amateurs. Earlier this month, millions of people got a chance to see the aurora borealis for the first time, as the northern lights were active farther south than they had been in decades. The brilliant displays, visible as far south as Mexico, were a result of a series of coronal mass ejections. The energy from our star interacted with particles in the upper atmosphere, causing them to glow in dancing curtains of multicolored light. VHF aurora activity was up significantly according to DX spotting clusters and activity heard on the air. The 2 and 6 meter bands were especially active, as the aurora acted like a reflector in the sky to enable signals to propagate much farther than they normally can on those bands. ARRL Central Division Director Karl Lutzelschwab, K9LA, is a leading expert on propagation. He's provided the following analysis of the situation. May 10th, 11th, and 12th of 2024 may go down as one of the greatest space weather storm periods of our lifetimes. It all started with 2 big sunspots in early May. These 2 big sunspots were identified as AR3663 in the northern solar hemisphere and AR3664 in the southern solar hemisphere. AR stands for active region. Both of these sunspot regions produced multiple M-class and X-class solar flares, which caused radio blackouts, meaning that signals were significantly attenuated on the sunlit side of Earth. Typically, a radio blackout lasts for an hour or so, is most severe on the lower frequencies, and is due to the X-ray radiation from the solar flare increasing D-region absorption. Not only did the big solar flares cause radio blackouts, they also caused solar radiation storms due to energetic protons that increased ionospheric absorption in the D region in the polar caps, the area inside the auroral ovals. Solar radiation storms can last for a couple of days and can result in degraded propagation over the pole paths. But the biggest impact to propagation started on May 8th, when AR-3664 released multiple Earth-directed coronal mass ejections. CMEs manifest themselves as geomagnetic storms by significantly increasing the 3-hour K-index. The K-index indicates the activity of the Earth's magnetic field and ranges from 0 or quiet to 9 extremely disturbed. In summary, early May was a very interesting period. We saw all three categories of disturbances to propagation: radio blackouts caused by X-ray radiation from solar flares, solar radiation storms, which are energetic protons from solar flares, and geomagnetic storms, which are elevated K indices.
Proud to be among the very first podcasts on the Internet, you are listening to the weekly amateur radio news and bulletin service, This Week in Amateur Radio.
The Federal Communications Commission's Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau wants to know if you noticed any impacts to radio communications during the recent solar storm activity. John Ross, KD8IDJ, has more.
In a public notice, the FCC wrote, to better understand the impacts of the geomagnetic storm on the U.S. communications sector, the Bureau is requesting information from communication service providers and the public regarding disruptions in the communications between May 7th and May 11th, 2024, that it believes to be a result of that solar storm. The Bureau is encouraging commenters to provide any available evidence, particularly electromagnetic spectrum analyses, imagery, or chronological logs relating to the storm's impacts. Where possible, the Bureau asks that the comments include the description of the impacts, make and model of the affected communications equipment, which could include transmitters, receivers, transceivers, switches, routers, and amplifiers, and also make, model, and type of affected antennae and their composition, frequencies affected, type of composition of cable adjoining communications equipment, and the antennae if applicable. Also during the event, any residual effects observed in the hours following restoration. I'm John Ross, KD8IDJ.
Comments may be submitted using FCC's electronic comment filing system at www.fcc.gov/ECFS and referring to FS Docket 24-161. ARRL's guide to filing comments is available at the League website.
The most recent ARRL section manager elections ending on May 10th resulted in 2 incumbent section managers being re-elected for another 2-year term. Both will continue with the work that they have been doing in their sections. In the Northern Florida section, Scott Roberts, KK4ECR, held a lead over challenger James Kvachik, K8JK. This will be Roberts' second term as section manager. The vote count for the election was 657 for Roberts and 308 for Kvachik. In the Indiana section, incumbent Bob Burns, AK94, defeated challenger Brian Jenks, W9BGJ. The vote count ended with Burns receiving 684 votes and Jenks receiving 161 votes. Congratulations to both returning section managers.
The ARRL Foundation announces the return of the Club Grant Program for 2024. The program is an opportunity for clubs to apply for grants up to $25,000 to fund projects in their community. The emphasis is given to projects that are of transformational nature, such as a club that has to plan to improve the community through education, recruiting, training, and promotion of amateur radio. The application period will open up at 9 a.m. Eastern Time on June 3rd and close at 4 p.m. Eastern Time on July 26th. Clubs across the country are urged to apply. The program is not restricted to the ARRL affiliated clubs or 501c3 clubs. Those clubs that were awarded grants will be required to share updates and participate in social media and reporting with the ARRL. Information about the Club Grant Program can be found on the League's webpage. The ARRL Club Grant Program is made possible through generous funding by the Amateur Radio Digital Communications.
Project Oscar, the organization responsible for the construction and launch of the first amateur radio satellite, Oscar 1 in 1961, as well as Oscars 2, 3, and 4, has discontinued operations and donated its remaining funds to AMSAT. Project Oscar Incorporated was originally formed to investigate the possibility of putting an amateur satellite in orbit. The first amateur radio satellite, Oscar 1, orbited the Earth for 22 days, transmitting the HI greeting in Morse code. Since that beginning, the group has focused on supporting and promoting amateur radio satellite-related projects. In addition to donating its remaining funds to AMSAT, Project Oscar also granted AMSAT ownership of the future rights to the term Oscar, or orbiting satellite carrying amateur radio. Ever since the launch of Oscar 1 in 1961, it has been traditional for amateur radio satellites to carry the name Oscar after their launch and activation in orbit. For several decades, AMSAT has administered the numbering of Oscar satellites at Project Oscar's request. To date, 121 satellites have received Oscar designations. AMSAT is greatly appreciative of all those who have been involved in Project Oscar over the past 64 years. The large and growing amateur satellite community owes its existence to those early pioneers who decided that amateur radio had a place in space and made it happen. AMSAT is committed to upholding the legacy of those early pioneers and keeping amateur radio in space.
It was only 6 years ago, 2018, that the Baker Island D-Expedition changed the face of digital QSOs when it debuted the Foxhound submode of WSJT-X. Joe Taylor, K1JT, and his dedicated team of software developers and testers have provided hundreds of thousands of D-Expedition QSOs in the succeeding years. Never resting on what was good enough yesterday, Joe Taylor's team will soon offer a SuperFox mode of WSJT-X for making rapid FT8 QSOs. Hounds chasing the SuperFox DX station will transmit normal FT8 signals, but rather than sending concurrent streams of up to 5 FT8 signals, the SuperFox station will transmit a single constant envelope using a 1.5 kHz wide waveform that conveys signal reports or RR73 acknowledgments to as many as 9 different hounds simultaneously. Another very significant improvement will be a digital signature contained in the SuperFox message that will allow the receiving software to verify the legitimate origin of the signal from a validated D-Expedition. The SuperFox development team will be beta testing the software in the coming weeks, with the goal to have it rolled out in time to debut during the N5J Jarvis Island D-Expedition a few months from now.
2024 ARRL Field Day is June 22nd and 23rd. To tell us more about the amateur radio's favorite annual event and how to find a field day operation near you, we go to John Ross, KD8IDJ, at League Headquarters.
The annual event is part emergency communications exercise, part operating event, and part open house for amateur radio. No matter what your local club makes a field day, it is sure to be a good opportunity for hams and members of the public to gather socially in a public place and celebrate the joy of radio and wireless communication. ARRL's Field Day Locator at www.arrl.org/fielddaylocator is an interactive tool to help you find a field day site near you or to list your club's field day location so that members of the public and the media may attend. Populating your group's information into the database is easy. ARRL Radio Sport and Regulatory Manager Bart Janke, W9JJ, says social media should always be used to let interested people know where you are going to be. Use social media before and during 2024 ARRL Field Day to help people find you. Let them know what your plans are, who is going to be there, and what they can expect if they visit, he said. Making newcomers feel welcome and getting them involved is important. Get them on the air. Show them how to make contacts with the GOTA, Get On The Air station, encouraged ARRL Contest Program Manager Paul Bork, N1 SFE. People may not remember what you show and tell them, but they will always remember how you made them feel welcomed and involved by allowing them to participate. Your time in showing a newcomer what radio is all about is an investment in the future of ham radio. To encourage visitors to come to the event, Janke recommends contacting local dignitaries or served agency partners who frequently attend field day events. I'm John Ross, KD8IDJ.
For complete rules and promotional materials for 2024's Field Day, visit the Field Day landing page on League's webpage.
Wind damage to half of its phased array antenna has left radio station WWVB operating at reduced power outside Fort Collins, Colorado. The winds that struck the south antenna in early April were estimated to be higher than 90 miles per hour. The National Institute of Standards and Technology operates the timekeeping site. People throughout North America rely on WWVB's broadcasts to synchronize their watches, clock radios, and other consumer electronics. It is also used for accurate time synchronization and for timekeeping applications in appliances, cameras, and irrigation controllers. Since the wind damage occurred, the station is broadcast using its north antenna only and on reduced power. The National Institute of Standards and Technology explained the change in an announcement recorded on the 11th of May and posted on YouTube. There is also a notice on the NIST website.
You're listening to North America's premier amateur radio and technology news magazine of the air. We are This Week in Amateur Radio, distributed worldwide at twiar.net.
It is time for the Volunteer Monitor Program Report. The Volunteer Monitor Program is a joint initiative between the ARRL and the FCC to enhance compliance in the amateur radio service. This is the activity report of the VM program. Operators in Arizona, Tennessee, Virginia, and South Carolina were issued advisory notices concerning wideband operation, 7 kHz to 8 kHz wide, contrary to FCC rules. Section 97.307 Subpart A provides that no amateur shall occupy more bandwidth than necessary for the information rate and emission type being transmitted in accordance with good amateur practice. Technician class operators in Colorado and North Carolina received advisory notices for operating FT8 on 20 meters. Technicians have no 20-meter operating privileges. An operator in New York received an advisory notice for failure to identify during long transmissions of more than 30 minutes. A general class operator in Idaho received an advisory notice for single sideband transmissions on 14.150 MHz. General class privileges start at 14.225 MHz on that band. Meanwhile, operators in Florida received commendations for work on the 146.625 MHz W4JUP repeater, assisting new licensees to learn repeater procedures, and setting up equipment. An operator in Oklahoma received a commendation for work on the 146.97 W5BLW repeater for Skywarn and emergency operations procedures. During the month, there was one referral from the FCC to the VM program, and one meeting was held with the FCC. The totals for monitoring this month were 1,942 hours on HF frequencies and 1,935 hours on VHF frequencies and above, for a total of 3,877 hours of monitoring. We thank Volunteer Monitor Program Administrator Riley Hollingsworth, K4ZDH, for this report.
Hams in the Pacific Northwest have an exciting opportunity this weekend as many radio amateurs will descend on the Seaside Convention Center for CPAC, the Northwest's largest ham convention. The event is hosting the 2024 ARRL Northwestern Division Convention. ARRL will have a presence at the event with ARRL President Rick Roderick, K5UR, Second Vice President Mike Ritz, W7VO, Northwestern Division Director Mark Tharp, KB7HDX, and Education and Learning Manager Steve Goodgame, K5ATA, among the representatives. The event will host many informative seminars, workshops, commercial exhibits, a flea market, and plenty of opportunities to visit with fellow radio enthusiasts. Information is available on the CPAC website at www.cpac.org. That's www.seapac.org.
The second day of the 2024 ARRL National Convention, hosted at the Dayton Hamvention, was a success, and the attendee turnout was impressive. The chilly, cloudy morning soon gave way to mostly blue skies. The heavy attendance was especially apparent in the expo buildings, as hordes of hams flocked to the manufacturers' booths, not only to get out of the heat, but to browse a huge variety of equipment. The aisles were flanked by exhibitors like Flex Radio, ABR Industries, Bigali Keys, ICOM, Gigaparts, DX Engineering, Ham Radio Outlet, and many more big names in the amateur radio manufacturing community. At the ARRL exhibit booths, Eric Stoddard, K8ERS, stands aside the ARRL monobeam dual-band antenna he just purchased. Looks like it's going to be a good antenna, and hopefully it'll perform as well as it looks, and that in the next few weeks it'll be on the air, he said, before disappearing back into the sea of other hams, most of whom are also carrying new purchases. The antenna is perfect for hams with limited space who would like to take advantage of the global operating opportunities that Propagation is affording near the peak of solar cycle 25. It features an integrated 10-meter Moxon and a 6-meter Yagi. The first Bright Youth presenter out of many of sixth graders, Cameron Fry, KD9 VGV, and only 2 years after being introduced to amateur radio, he's become a general class operator, fully fledged Parks on the Air fanatic, and that's just part of his ham radio repertoire. I've done more than 100 central activations, he said, in more than 40 different parks. He also has hunted for more than 700 different parks, said Fry with pride. The youth rally continued for most of the day with a slew of activities planned for the young hams. To break the ice, the young people were encouraged to catch a satellite pass outside the forum room that just happened to be overhead at the start of the rally's next phase. The youth rally was capped off with a forum about the ARRL Collegiate Amateur Radio Program, featuring speakers from many of the participating colleges and universities. Another jam-packed Hamvention Saturday is in the books, and the final day of the event will surely be one to remember.
The 2024 ARRL National Convention hosted at Dayton Hamvention is a wrap. The final half day on Sunday morning is a slight departure from the thrilling bustle of Friday and Saturday. Radio amateurs were making a final effort to get by and see everything on their list, a tall order with 5 exhibit halls full of vendors. The weather gave a break from Saturday's scorching heat, a sunny, cool breeze through the fairgrounds giving comfort to the last-minute con-goers. Inside Forum Room 3, the ARRL National Convention track presentations continued to engage members. Sunday started with ARRL Field Services Manager Mike Walters' WHZY Tips for Successful Radio Clubs. Amateur radio clubs are constantly adapting to challenges with recruiting and maintaining membership, and the exchange of advice between clubs has become essential. This talk was followed by the ARRL Contest Program Update, presented by ARRL Contest Program Manager Paul Burke, N1 SFE, and ARRL Radio Sport Manager Bart Yankee, W9JJ. They overviewed several new changes to ARRL's on-air operating events, including limited antenna overlay being added to HF contests, a youth overlay being added to all contests, and overlays being added to certificates. Additionally, changes were made to the 10 GHz and up contest rules. Proposed dates to the upcoming 2025 Earth-Moon-Earth contest have been released as well. The forum schedule concluded with ARRL Lab Digital RF engineer John McAuliffe, W1DRF, presenting Beyond Repeaters. See how far your tech license will take you. This compelling presentation features many of the underutilized activities that technician class operators should take advantage of, like UHF and VHF operation, EME, and digital packet radio. Tech class hams took notice of all the activities they have not known were possible with their license privileges. These presentations will be archived on the ARRL HQ YouTube in the 2024 ARRL National Convention playlist. As solar cycle 25 continues to peak, the activity on the 6 and 10 meter bands offers a lot of potential DX to technicians. The new ARRL Momo Beam dual band beam antenna is a good tool for techs seeking to extend their reach. More information is available at www.arrl.org/beam. You can see a photo album of all the action you may have missed on the ARRL Facebook page.
The Hamcation Committee is currently accepting nominations for the Orlando Hamcation 2025 Recognition Awards. It is a great time to acknowledge individuals making an outstanding contribution to our wonderful amateur radio community. The individuals deserving of the Hamcation Awards are not necessarily ones seeking recognition for what they do. This is what the ham radio community is all about. Help us recognize outstanding contributors of the radio community by submitting a nomination or two for the Carol Perry Educator of the Year and Gordon West Ambassador of the Year awards. The Carol Perry Educator of the Year award is bestowed to an individual who has made an outstanding contribution to educating and advancing youth in amateur radio. The Gordon West Ambassador of the Year award is presented to an outstanding amateur who represents and inspires others, embodies the amateur radio spirit, and has made outstanding contributions to the amateur radio community. Nominations close November 1st, 2024. We hope you join us at the Orlando Hamcation 2025, which will be held February 7th through the 9th, 2025. More information available on the web at hamcation.com.
You are listening to This Week in Amateur Radio, available as an on-demand stream from Spotify, Deezer, and wherever podcasts are available.
Three days of festivities for the 2024 ARRL National Convention, hosted by Dayton Hamvention, concluded on Sunday, May 19th. With more details, we go to John Ross, KD8IDJ, who files this special report.
Thousands of ARRL members were among the crowds of radio amateurs who descended on the fairgrounds in Xenia, Ohio. The convention theme, Be Radioactive, was played out in a variety of ARRL-sponsored exhibits, presentations, and activities. One particular focus area was on youth involvement in amateur radio. On Saturday, ARRL hosted a youth rally that drew dozens of young people for an all-day immersion into ham radio interest and activities. It was great to see the kids fired up about ham radio, said ARRL Education and Learning Manager Steve Goodgame, KA5ATA. They got to make radio contact with a parachute mobile station, learn about satellites, and really put radio concepts into action. In his forum, Youth Outreach Through Amateur Radio STEM Education, Goodgame shared the keys to success ARRL has found in helping grow interest in radio among the next generation. A video recording of the forum is available on the ARRL HQ YouTube channel. Within the large ARRL exhibit area was a booth for the ARRL Collegiate Amateur Radio Program, known as CARP, staffed by student volunteers. They welcomed college-aged hams, helping network students from all over the world. Amateur radio needs more youth involved, said Ruslan Gildulan, KE8ZCA R9WFW, a student at Case Western Reserve University, who volunteered with the CARP booth. On Saturday afternoon, Morgan Lyons, KI5SXY, led the ARRL Collegiate Amateur Radio Forum. Lyons is a student attending Missouri University of Science and Technology and president of the Missouri S&T Amateur Radio Club, W0EEE. Throughout the convention, ARRL President Rick Roderick, K5UR, and other volunteer leaders of the association visited with members and answered questions. We've had so many members come by and talk about things going on in amateur radio, things amateur radio is doing. It has just been fantastic, said Roderick. I'm John Ross, KD8IDJ.
The next ARRL National Convention will be hosted by the Huntsville Hamfest in Huntsville, Alabama in August 2026.
Hello and welcome to the DX Corner for your weekly dose of DX. I'm Bill, AJ8B. I received an email from Janet, WHCAA. Janet mentioned that they often listen to the DX Corner but aren't able to take notes and copy down URLs that we mention. Is the text available anywhere? Well, Janet, it is. I use most of the same data that you hear in the DX Corner for the weekly DX column in the Ohio Section Journal. If you were to Google ARRL Ohio section, you will find the Ohio section website, and from there you can subscribe to the weekly newsletter. You don't have to be an ARRL member, and it doesn't cost anything. And with that, you'll get most of the information that I talk about in the DX column. The actual website is arrl-ohio.org. To be honest, all you'll get is the DX column. You won't get the wealth and breadth of information that you get from your This Week in Amateur Radio podcast, but if you're looking for some specific URLs and dates, you can get them there as well. So here's what's happening in the world of DX. This section of DX News comes from Bernie, W3UR, editor of the Daily DX, the Weekly DX, and the How's DX column in QST. If you would like a free 2-week trial of the Daily DX, just drop me a note at thedxmentor@gmail.com. Glorioso Island, FT4GL, is now on the air. FH4VVK Marek has now been on the air as FT4GL for over a week. Marek's activity is intensive, and he carries it out in Spartan conditions at the station, which is also his workplace and his place to sleep, and frankly, he's getting very little sleep. As with most DXpeditions, there have been logistical issues. The originally planned location had air conditioning problems. Another room was found, but it was, quote, more cramped. Also, the initial antenna installation had to be modified with difficulties in optimizing the choice of locations in view of the various structures that were present. Marek was able to complete the installation of the second hex beam, so for the moment there are 2 hex beams, a vertical for 40 through 10 meters, a vertical for 30, and a 5-element beam for 6 meters. The 160 meter stroke 80 meter vertical still has to be assembled. 2 stations are active as planned. Some electrical problems have been reported with the inverters, resulting in some temporary outages, as well as interference linked to equipment external to the installations, which is being resolved. There's also been a problem with an amplifier. Logs are posted online daily, either in the morning or evening following the previous day's traffic. For all requests, contact F8CRS@protonmail.com. That's F8CRS@protonmail.com, who is responsible for checking and possibly validating the requests. As of May 26th, with more than 16,000 QSOs, the dupe rate is decreasing. The organizers have received requests for low bands, 6 meters, and RTTY QSOs. They ask the community to please be patient. The operation has just started and it will last 3 weeks. As a reminder, Marek is alone and cannot respond to all requests. The priority is all-time new ones, and then other DX. Our pilots are starting to give us feedback in order to direct traffic more precisely to satisfy the greatest number of operators. So here's an update on Minami Torishima, Julia Delta 1/M. JG8NQJ Taki plans to be back at his weather station job on Minami Torishima starting June 20th. He will be there in QRV, and his spare time is JG8NQJ/JD1 for 3 months. Listen for him mainly on CW and possibly some FT8. Taki is running an ICOM IC706 at 50 watts to an HB9CV antenna. You can QSL via Logbook of the World and JA8CJY. The Mediterranean DX Club, XT2MD, DXpedition to Burkina Faso website is now up and running. The site includes information about the band plan, equipment, antennas, operators, and QSL policy. So you can check out the XT2MD website for further updates. So now another African country, Niger, 5 Uniform. 5 Uniform 5 Kilo with IV3 FSG Elvira operating is June 6th to the 20th. Elvira will be on single sideband FT8, FT4, MSHV multistream, RTTY, and possibly a little CW on 160 through 6 meter bands. This is located in grid JN13BM. Back at home, Francesco IK0XBX will be pilot. Her target transmit frequencies can be found on their website. You can look it up in QRZ.com, 5 Uniform 5 Kilo. You can QSL direct to IK2DUW. So here's an operation from Crete, SV9. SV9 stroke DK5EW Irwin plans on operating May 30th to June 20th, 6 and 4 meters only. First, The grid KM35 will be handled May 30th to June 5th. Then grid KM15 will be handled June 8th to the 20th. QSL through Logbook of the World, EQSL, or direct to DK5 EW. We have another update on Malpelo Island, HK0M. Members of the Board of Directors of Liga Colombiana de Radio de Aficionados, LCRA, have announced plans to activate Malpelo Island with hopes that this project will take place in February of 2026. HK0M was last on the air in 2012. More details such as dates, team members, etc. will be announced after the needed permits have been acquired. Just QRX for a while. You can get more details at lcra.org.co. And finally, we have an update on VU4, Andaman and Nicobar Islands. I have to admit I was disappointed I missed this one last time there was a DXpedition there, so I'm looking forward to this one. This is from the DX Adventure team. DX Adventure is proud to announce its next DXpedition to take place in the first quarter of 2025 to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Our international team, consisting of over 10 experienced operators, is eager to embark on this adventure. This time we're focusing on the Andaman and Nicobar Islands VU4, currently ranked 54th of the most wanted DXCC entities in the world. During this DXpedition, we'll be active on all bands using CW sideband and digital. This offers a fantastic opportunity for radio amateurs worldwide to work this DXCC IOTA location. More news can be found later on dxadventure.com. And of course, as things break, I'll keep you updated as well. Until next week, this is Bill, AJB saying 7-3, and I hope to see you in the pileups.
You are listening to This Week in Amateur Radio, available as an on-demand stream from Spotify, Deezer, and wherever podcasts are available.
And now, This Week in Amateur Radio presents a talk given by Volunteer Monitor Program Coordinator Riley Hollingsworth, K4ZDH. His talk was a part of the Good Operators and Interference Forum.
May is a horrible month at our house. We've had rain, high winds, everything starts growing. Dog digs holes in the yard, and the other day my wife said, "I'll help you. You're going crazy, let me cut the grass." We had to get this new lawnmower. And I said, "No, I'll cut the grass. I got cables in the backyard. Let me cut the grass." She said, "No, I know where they are. I know exactly where they are." And she did. That's one of them she found that one. But she supports amateur radio and all the poles in the yard, so I guess I can't fault her. All right, there's only a couple of numbers. An accountant told me one time that numbers don't lie, but if you torture them long enough, they'll tell you anything you want to hear. There's only two numbers on here that are important. The hours monitoring HF is almost 25,000 for last year, but the advisory notices 147, which is a pretty good percentage. Now the complaints that the VMs filed were 364, but we go through those. We don't ping you if you didn't identify for 20 minutes instead of 10 minutes or something like that. We don't worry about that stuff, and we know that a good number of technicians actually think that you can work FT8 on 40 meters because there's some erroneous band plans out there. So these numbers will come down, but please look every month in QST. There's a summary of the VM program for that month, and please look at that because you need to know what's going on. So I said I'd do it in 10 minutes. The FCC is very, very busy. Just go sometime to the FCC Gov website and Google the Daily Digest or search the Daily Digest. You'll see that it's 3 or 4 pages long, and it's things like Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, market-based applications, it's satellite stuff, it's Homeland Security-based licensing terminations. There's all kinds of stuff on here that doesn't even relate to RF. There's one here, Hispanic Community Network, or rescheduling order, revising the hearing. There's just tons of stuff on here, and they have half the staff and half the engineers that they used to. And I don't know how they do it, but they do a very good job. And they have the problem that, I don't know if you saw the news last night, but they knew, and the FCC has this problem, especially the people in the field. Last night on CNN it was reported that the heaviest element known to science was discovered by investigators at a major U.S. research university. This was just last night. The element is tentatively named administratium. It has no protons or electrons, and thus has an atomic number of 0. However, it does have 1 neutron, 125 assistant neutrons, 75 vice neutrons, and 111 assistant vice neutrons. Since it has no electrons, it's inert, but it can be detected chemically because it impedes every reaction it comes in contact with. And according to the discoverers, a minute amount of administratium causes one reaction to take over 4 months to complete, when it normally would have occurred in half an hour. So that's what LARC and all the people in the field and all of the agencies are putting up with. And it's just a sign of the times. It'll change. Your role, the best thing you can do to help, and part of this theme this morning is how you can help. Just realize that you have privileges and not rights. Look at your license. Look at the back of it. It talks about privileges. And please realize that this wonderful hobby we have, you need to joyfully pay it forward. And you know what we need on the bands overall? It's very simple. We need a little more kindness on all the bands. Moving frequencies when you don't have to. And I have some messages for in that regard. But we're a cross-section of society now, unfortunately. And since COVID, people are angry. There's road rage. We had road rage growing up. We solved it with finger gestures, and that was it. We didn't shoot anybody's windshield out. There's airline rage. There's rudeness, selfishness, and society today reminds me of Charles Manson's statement when he interviewed Diane Sawyer many years ago. Maybe he was a prophet. Charles Manson said, used to it meant something to be crazy. Now it seems like everyone's getting crazy. Man, is that a prediction of the future or what? Just don't add to the problem. You can do a lot of good in society generally and on the amateur bands. Just don't add to the problem. But I want you to think about the big knob again. If you go out on the flea market, and I did yesterday, I saw a Swan 350 had one big knob. You go over and look at the new Yaesu or the new ICOM or the Kenwood, one big knob. You look at 1946 issue of QST, which I did before I came out here. I thought I'd see my picture in it, but I didn't. All of the stuff in there, and a lot of it they built, one big knob. And you look at the ARRL catalog or DX Engineering, there's one big knob. There's a reason for that. 95% of the problems on our bands can be avoided if you just turn the big knob for a few kilohertz. It's there for a reason. If not, it'd be a little knob. And I remember as a kid looking at equipment in Allied radio catalog, and I'd count the knobs and buttons. And I said, man, this has got 37 knobs and buttons. I want this one. This over here has 25 and it only weighs 30 pounds. This weighs 57 pounds. That's the one I want. But I have several messages, too, to wrap up here. And it's great going last because I just sat there and thinned out my pages as you went on. But to the nets, that's right. Some of them had two big knobs if you have a second VFO. But I got several messages. To the nets, it doesn't matter how long you've been on that frequency. Frequencies are shared. And a group of operators who have been on the same frequency for a decade using 1,200 watts, when 100 would do just fine, that's not a net. That's a round table. And the world's not going to end if you don't run that net one night. The world won't end. To the widebanders, if you want to run a broadcast station, just apply for one. Don't open your bandwidth up on crowded frequencies. It's very rude and it's very inconsiderate. To the contesters, just use a little more courtesy and remember that even when you're operating split, you don't own that frequency. To those who don't like contesters, just lighten up. If they're bothering you, go to the work bands or cut the grass, wax the car, do stuff you probably should be doing anyway. And learn from contesters because contesters are the best operators in the world. To the traffic nets. You need to learn from contesters how to get messages through and not take 5 minutes to get a 30-second message with phonetics through when you know that you're already 20 or 30 over. To those who don't like FT8, FT8 has rejuvenated the amateur radio service. There were those who didn't like Echolink. Echolink rejuvenated repeaters. There's no new development like that is going to harm us. I remember the AM and single sideband wars, when the AMers would say that's not radio, it sounds like a duck, and for God's sakes, it doesn't even have a carrier. But nothing bad came of that. Some of us thought the world would end when code was eliminated. But if you go out there today, they're selling more code keys and keyers than they were years ago, and a lot of young people are interested in it because they don't have to do it, and it's kind of a secret code. And I remember the best way to ruin a book in high school was to put it on the required reading list. And so now that you don't have to learn code, I think even more people are getting interested in it. To repeater owners, you don't own the frequency just because you're coordinated or because your call sign is on there. Nobody asked you to start a repeater, and you can't ask us to babysit it. It's your base station, just like the base station in your house is. And there are 22,000 repeaters in the country. And the repeater users know the service area and the people in the repeater best. So they're most able to run down the interference and do some fox hunting, do what you have to do to find it. But we can't send a VM out because they don't know anything necessarily about your repeater. You've got to find it. And once you do, it's a different story. We can help you, or once you at least find a street or an address. To the QRPers, thank you for bringing back enthusiasm into amateur radio. I went to a QRP building session out here many years ago, which was a day before Dayton. And just the enthusiasm in that room, if you could bottle that, it'd be fantastic. And to those who don't like QRPers, anybody can use a linear amplifier as a crutch. So these QRPers are amazing operators, and how you could get 100 countries or 150, whatever, on QRP, I don't understand it.
We will return with the conclusion of a talk given by Volunteer Monitor Program Coordinator Riley Hollingsworth, K4ZDH, after we pause for stations along the network to identify.
To those who don't like de-expeditions, if a group of people want to go to an island and sit on a rock in the ocean with the waves lapping at their butt and swat scorpions or mosquitoes in 100-degree weather, just let them do it. Just lighten up and let them do it. It's chaos, but only for a limited time, and then it's over with. And once again, there's the big knob. There's a reason why you have thousands of frequencies and one big knob. And too many of us are like, or too many people these days are like what you see at a shopping center, an argument over a parking space when there's 150 vacant parking spaces. And it's just the nature of our society today. It's very unfortunate, and hopefully it's a pendulum. And they say that once you detect a social trend and fully understand it, it's already started to swing back. And I hope that's the case. You can do a lot on your bands to make them better just by not getting involved, because the problems on our bands aren't from no-coders. But you hear longtime licensees whine about them when they themselves haven't worked a CW contact in years. Everybody makes mistakes, and nobody in our program is going to get in trouble for making mistakes. There's not an extra in this room, I guarantee you, that hasn't called CQ on a dummy load and wondered why they didn't get an answer. There's not an extra in this room that hadn't turned on the transceiver and wondered what was wrong with the audio and realized that the headphones were still plugged in from the night before. The problems on our bands aren't from new licensees. They make honest mistakes, and that's fine. We want them to make mistakes. That's the way you learn. The problems are usually from long-term licensees who think they know everything, and they had to draw a Colpitts oscillator, and they think everybody should have to do that. They don't like newcomers, and they use a kilowatt to talk across the state night after night and call it a net, and they never tried anything new, not even 17 meters. And they haven't done any real radio in years, but they'll criticize new licensees. But unlike in the past, they don't go out of their way to help them either. I don't know about you, but I didn't get into amateur radio all by myself. It was I was interested in it, and I overheard a conversation about amateur radio, and I built a shortwave radio, the Nightcap Space Spanner, which I still have. And my uncle told me, he said, I don't know anything about it, but there's a fella here in town, Morris Hall, who's a ham operator. I'll take you over there. He took me to Morris Hall's house, and Morris had all Collins equipment, and to a kid interested in radio, to see all Collins equipment lit up and smell the tubes, you don't get over that. You never forget it the rest of your life. An interesting story, when I got into amateur enforcement, I had done land mobile and trunking, and I ran the channel recovery program that got back unused business channels in 13 cities. Got back into amateur radio, and I was a little bit appalled at what I heard, but I was sitting there in the office one day, and I wondered whatever happened to Morris Hall. So over the next few weeks, I looked him up, and still living in the same house in South Carolina. I talked to his wife. She said, Morris is in a nursing home. I don't know if he'll remember you, but 2 or 3 days a week he has lucid moments, lucid days, and he might just remember you. So I got in touch with him at the nursing home, called him on a lucid day, and I said, do you remember when my Uncle LD and I came over? He and LD were friends. He said, I do. Did you ever get a license? And I said, yeah, I did. I did, Morris. In fact, I'm in charge of amateur radio enforcement for the United States. And he cried. And that's who I work for. When I was at the FCC and for the league, that's who I work for, the people whose shoulders I stand on that gave me amateur radio. If you have that gratitude and that appreciation, then the only thing that will harm amateur radio is the microphone. And that's us talking on it. The people that you hear on the bands at night, and by the way, we deleted on this chart that you saw, I think you took off the recidivism rate. What were you thinking? Anyway, we ran some numbers, and decided to measure, of all these people that got these advisory notices, how many of them repeated the problem, repeated the violation or whatever. And it was less than 0.5%. So we know they're listening to it. And these are gentle nudges. If it's somebody that is on a band where they needed to upgrade, we'll offer to help them upgrade. So it's a nudge. It's firm, but it's a nudge as well. But the exception is 3 frequencies, 1 on 40 and 2 on 75, and I don't want to mention those frequencies because it's my conclusion after 10 years of this work that those frequencies cause brain damage. And we're working on those frequencies, and I won't tell you what they were. I deleted it from the report. I reported it to the league because I don't even want you to listen to them. I don't want any of you to get brain damage. But we're working on it, and we know about it. But the people that give us the problems don't remember what Edward R. Murrow said, the famous news commentator. Edward R. Murrow said, just because your voice can be heard around the world doesn't mean you're any wiser than when it could be heard at the end of the bar. And that's something to think about, every day. Let's all try to appreciate this great avocation that joyfully occupies our lives. And if you operate with appreciation, you'll do a lot to help us in the bands, and you'll do a lot to avoid problems. And also remember, and I could take all these badges off, I think I did last year, but we don't have any representation before the FCC or even internationally, except for the league. And we need more numbers. We need to boost membership. We need numbers. The only thing standing between amateur radio and oblivion is the league. sometimes at the FCC, or a lot of times at the FCC, I'd have to go over to what we call the 8th floor, which is where all the commissioners' offices were, to work on an item or something. And it always amazed me that everybody was there, even Netflix, all the broadcasters, the internet people. It was like a train station in there. But anytime it was an FCC issue, an amateur radio issue, there was one or two people from the league. That's all the representation that we have. And we've got to have it because we're standing on a lot of valuable spectrum. And I remember at the FCC, the idea of using 800 megahertz drew laughter. Then a few years later, their frequencies were being auctioned off in those ranges for millions and millions of dollars. So it may be that we have our spectrum because because it's inherently unstable, or because nobody's thought of a good use for it yet. But we saw people come in with these crazy ideas, and later on they made fortunes off of it because they were good ideas. And an old fella came in one day with this thing that you could place it on a device, and you could walk by and shoot it with what he called his RF gun, and it would read what that device was measuring. And we were thinking, this guy has a lot of time on his hands. Well, the Detroit Utilities Department bought thousands of those because their utility, the people that measured the power meters were afraid to get out of the truck in a lot of areas of Detroit. They're installed on meters now, probably just about everywhere. And the utility guy can go right down the road, shoot those meters, and get a reading. And it was the same way with the fellow that came in with a device that would measure temperature from 30 feet. And we said, this guy's just playing, he's experimenting. Well, trains use those to determine hot boxes or hot bearings. They're very common. So maybe you say, nobody will ever want 75 meters. Well, that's now at 1033. It may not be true tomorrow. And as you know, some of the high volume stock trading companies are experimenting with HF because it can be faster than the internet. So you just have to be grateful for what we have and use it and realize with how valuable our privileges are. And I think if you do that, you won't have any problems. And if you hear bad conduct on the bands, don't add to it. Maybe you'll have to cut loose a net or a couple of friends that get a little too raunchy on the bands. I've had to do that to some of the nets. They're just an embarrassment. I'm not going to deal with them. Just don't deal with them. Don't engage them. And especially with interferers, don't engage them. All they want is a reaction. And my grandfather told me two things when I was a kid, and very valuable lessons in life. One is, when I was about 12, he said, son, you're going to learn that some people are just crazy as hell. And they drive cars, they make babies, they vote, but they're just crazy. And if you understood them, you'd be as crazy as they are. And that's true today. It's a little more true today, I think, because COVID has broken our ties, broken our bonds. And we'll be looking at the effects of COVID on society for 25 years. And I won't see the results. I wish I could, but I've had too many Hamfest hot dogs, so I won't be around. I don't care what kind of life-enhancing drugs they come out with. I will not be here. The second thing he told me was, when you're working on something and you can't figure it out, just let it sit a while. And I thought that was the dumbest thing I ever heard. And I said, Grandpa, it's not going to fix itself. He said, you'll see what I mean. And we've all seen that with radio equipment. Just let it sit a while, let your subconscious work on this, and you'll think of a remedy or you'll think of a different approach. But the first thing about the crazy people, between him and Charles Manson, I have nightmares. And I hope that it's a pendulum, and I hope that it will swing back. But just don't add to it. You can do a world of difference by not adding to the problem and being grateful for the thousands of frequencies we have and the big knob that we have. Thank you.
Are you ready for another excursion into amateur radio history? This is Bill Continelli, W2XOY, and I'll be back in a moment with another installment of the Ancient Amateur Archives.
You are listening to This Week in Amateur Radio, available to download as a podcast from anywhere on the web podcasts are available.
Last week, we brought you the story of the pirate radio ships and Radio Caroline. Well, if you think your shack needs an overhaul, imagine being a legendary pirate broadcaster in the UK. Radio Caroline has marked 6 decades of radio off the coast of England and is still sailing ahead with its planned restoration of the Ross Revenge, the vessel moored in the Blackwater estuary that the former pirate broadcaster calls home. The fishing trawler turned broadcast studio and radio broadcasting facility replaced the Mi Amigo, Radio Caroline's previous pirate ship, which sank in a storm in 1980. Radio Caroline first went on the air on March 28, 1964, when it was only able to operate from outside of the British territorial waters. The support group that now runs the station was finally granted an AM broadcast license from Ofcom in 2017 with a frequency previously used by the BBC. A 3-day anniversary celebration last March provided an open house to listeners and other fans who had come to celebrate its legacy. Organizers hope the anniversary festivities will provide an impetus for fundraising that can cover the cost of need of overhaul of the Ross Revenge, which was built in 1960.
And now, with this week's edition of the Ancient Amateur Archives, here's Bill Continelli, W2XOY.
In our last installment, we traced the development of FM and repeaters from 1932 up to 1970. Since the FCC rules at that time had no provision for repeater operation, stations in repeater service were operated under the Part 97 provisions covering remote control. The FCC, in February 1970, came out with docket number 18803, which set forth the Commission's proposed repeater rules. These included small subbands set aside for repeater operation, a ban on linked, crossband, and multiband repeaters, a requirement for whistle-on or other tone control, and a requirement that the licensee of a repeater station be in attendance at the transmitter or at an authorized fixed control point to monitor all transmissions of the station. In regards to the 2-meter band, the FCC set up the repeater subband in such a way that 2/3 of it would not be accessible to technicians. Reaction was quick and negative. The ARRL and others felt that the proposed rules were so restrictive that they might be the end of amateur repeater operation as it existed at that time. Counter-proposals, far less restrictive than the FCC's, were submitted to the Commission. While amateurs waited for the revised FCC rules, another problem had to be solved. When 2-meter FM operations started in the 1960s, 146.94 had been chosen as the national simplex frequency. This was the highest wideband FM frequency available to technicians. After repeaters came along, amateurs discovered that the surplus commercial equipment in use had a maximum bandwidth of 600 kHz. Thus, 146.34 was chosen for the first repeater input. However, in areas where 9.4 was in heavy use by simplex stations, 146.76 was chosen as the output. This led to the problem of non-standard splits, and in some areas of the country, repeaters such as 3476, 2894, and 3482 could be found. The frequency 146.94 was a battleground between the simplex versus repeater groups. Amateurs were also fighting a minor battle over 146.64 MHz, which, in some parts of the country, was a DX simplex frequency. To make matters worse, all transceivers back then were crystal controlled. With crystals at $10 per pair, it would cost $120, or about $350 in today's money, to fill all 12 channels in a 2-meter radio. It was possible to equip your radio with the repeaters and simplex frequency used in one area, then find all of your channels were useless 200 miles away. A national plan was needed. The Texas VHF-FM Society proposed such a plan, which was described in the May 1972 issue of QST. In it, the repeater offset was standardized at 600 kilohertz, 146.94 and 146.64 became repeater outputs, 146.4 through 146.58 became simplex, and 146.52 was chosen as the national simplex frequency. In the 146 through 147 range, accessible to technicians and above, there were 13 repeater and 7 simplex channels. The 147 through 148 range, available only to generals and above, had 14 repeater and 6 simplex channels. Note that in the Texas plan, all repeater inputs were 600 kilohertz below the output, even in the 147 through 148 range. Except for changing the inputs to the high side above 147 megahertz, the Texas plan was adopted. The gradual acceptance of a 2-meter band plan still did not resolve the FCC issue. The Texas plan, as good as it was, violated the FCC's 1970 proposal. The Commission still had not issued any repeater rules, nor had they acted on the ARRL's 1969 request to give technicians the full 2-meter band. Finally, in September 1972, the FCC issued new rules covering repeaters, logging, and portable mobile operations. Liberal repeater subbands were authorized at 52 through 54, 146 through 148, 222 through 225, and 442 through 450 megahertz. Logging requirements, especially for repeater and mobile stations, was simplified. Repeater operators no longer needed a tape recorder hooked up to their stations. The requirement for a portable or mobile station to notify the FCC of operation in a particular radio district was also reduced. No longer would amateurs contemplating a cross-country trip with their radios have to write to each district on their journey in order to inform the engineer of the trip. Repeaters would have to be licensed. Call signs beginning with the prefix WR would be issued. The repeater license application was complex. Each applicant for a repeater license had to submit certain data to the FCC regarding the technical, operational, and effective radiated power of the proposed station. Whistle-on or tone control was no longer required. 2 repeaters could be linked, but multi-linked or cross-band repeaters were prohibited. Repeater monitoring and control requirements were made more flexible. And finally, the FCC acted in part on the ARRL's 1969 proposal. Although they did not give technicians full 2-meter privileges, they did grant them the 147 through 148 segment. Technicians could now operate on all 2-meter repeaters without violating FCC rules. The new FCC repeater rules, coupled with the Texas plan, caused a surge in 2-meter FM activity. It also was the shot in the arm the hobby needed to fully recover from the decrease in growth caused by incentive licensing. Manufacturers such as Drake, Standard, Regency, Tempo, Genève, Clegg, and Midland poured rigs onto the amateur market. Heathkit had the very successful HW202, followed by the even more popular HW2036. The increase in the number of technicians on 2-meter FM finally killed the technicians are experimenters, not communicators theory. And finally, thanks to 2-meter FM, amateur radio grew by over 33% in the 1970s. In 1975, due to increased demand, the FCC authorized the use of 144.5 through 145.5 megahertz for repeater operation. Technicians were given access to this subband. In 1978, the FCC relaxed the rules, eliminated the separate repeater license and the WR prefix, and gave technicians the full 2-meter band. From 1978 through 1981, the synthesized revolution took place as affordable PLL and microprocessor rigs drove the last of the crystal-controlled radios off the market. Today, a name-brand 2-meter HT costs about $175. With it, you can access over 4,000 repeaters or scan the VHF high band. Compare that to 1972, when a crystal-controlled radio equipped with 12 channels cost about $300, or about $800 in today's dollars. We truly have come a long way. In our next installment, we will look at a couple of license proposals in the mid-1970s and the controversy they caused. I hope you will join me. This is Bill Continelli, W2XOY, for This Week in Amateur Radio.
You're listening to North America's premier amateur radio and technology news magazine of the air. We are This Week in Amateur Radio, distributed worldwide at TWIAR.net.
Bruce Page, KK5DO, is here now with this week's AMSAT report. Bruce?
Thanks, John. Project Oscar and AMSAT have announced that Project Oscar, the organization responsible for the construction and launch of the first amateur radio satellite, Oscar-1, in 1961, as well as Oscars 2, 3, and 4, has discontinued operations and donated its remaining funds to AMSAT. Project Oscar has also granted AMSAT ownership to the future rights to the term Oscar, which stands for Orbiting Satellite Carrying Amateur Radio. To date, there have been 121 satellites that have received Oscar designation. AMSAT has been issuing the Oscar numbers for several decades as requested by Project Oscar. There has been a great relationship between the two organizations, and AMSAT is committed to upholding the legacy of those early pioneers and keeping amateur radio in space. This is Bruce Page, KK5DO. Back to you, John.
And thanks, Bruce, for that report.
It is time for the weekly solar weather and propagation forecast. Brought to us each week by Tad Cook, K7RA. Solar activity was quieter this week. Average daily sunspot number slipped from 155.1 to 124.6, and average solar flux from 198.9 to 164.8. Geomagnetic conditions were also quiet, with average planetary A index going from 13.9 to 7.9, and middle latitude A index from 11.7 to 9. 8 new sunspot groups emerged, 1 on May 23, 2 on May 25, 4 on May 26, and 1 on May 28. Looking at the solar flux for the near term, it will be 175 on June 2nd through June 6th, then 210, 200, 195, 190, 185 and 180 on June 7th through the 12th, and 170 on June 13th and 14th. The predicted planetary A index for the near term will be 5 on June 2nd through the 7, then 10, 12, 8, 12, and 10 on June 8th through the 12, and will remain steady at 5 on June 13th through the 19.
In radio sport this week, a lot of great contests. June 1st and 2nd, it's the 1010 International Open Season PSK contest. That's digital. On June 1st, the Tisa Cup CW contest, CW. And also on June 1st, the Wake Up QRP Sprint. That is CW. June 1st and 2nd, the Kentucky QSO Party, CW phone and digital. The UKSMG Summer Contest, CW phone and digital. That's June 1st and 2nd as well. Also on June 1st and 2nd, the IARU Regional 1 Field Day, CW, and the RSGP National Field Day, that is CW. Then on June 1st and 2nd, it's the ARRL International Digital Contest, that's digital and no ready. And make sure you visit the ARRL contest calendar for more events and information. Upcoming Section, State, and Division conventions on May 31st through June 2nd, it's CPAC hosting the ARRL Northwestern Division Convention in Seaside, Oregon. June 1st, the Atlanta Hamfest hosting the ARRL Georgia Convention. That's in Marietta, Georgia. On June 9th, the Breeze Shooters Hamfest hosting the ARRL Western Pennsylvania Section Convention. That's in Butler, Pennsylvania. And on June 15th, the ARRL Maine State Convention and Hamfest. That's in Augusta, Maine.
Foundations of Amateur Radio. It's hard to imagine today, but there was a time when there was no such thing as either the 80-metre or the 20-metre amateur band, let alone 2 metres or 70 centimetres. Picture this, it's the Roaring Twenties, the 1920s, that is. among a jazz-age burst of economic prosperity, modern technology such as automobiles, moving pictures, social and cultural dynamism, the peak of Art Deco, we're also in the middle of a radio boom, where the world is going crazy buying radios as fast as they can be constructed. There are hundreds of licensed broadcasters. The bands are getting crowded. Radio amateurs have been banned from the lucrative radio spectrum above 200 metres, and can only play in the useless shortwaves, using frequencies greater than 1500 kHz. And play they did. On the 2nd of May 1925, amateurs proved they could communicate with any part of the world at any time of the day or night, when Ernest J. Simmons, Golf 2 Oscar Delta, and Charles McClurkin Alpha 2 Charlie Mike made a daylight contact between Meadowley, Gerrards Cross, Buckinghamshire, England, and Strathfield, Sydney, New South Wales, Australia, on what we now call the 20-metre band. This contact occurred not once but regularly for several days, using 100 watts. To give you a sense of just how big news of this feat was, on the second scheduled contact, the Prime Minister of Australia, Stanley Bruce, sent a message to England's Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin. On occasion of this achievement, Australia sends greetings. If you recall, the IARU, the International Amateur Radio Union, was a fortnight old at this point. Less than a year later, contact was made using voice. Between the banning of radio amateurs from frequencies below 1500 kHz at the London International Radio Telegraph Conference in 1912 and the Washington International Radio Telegraph Conference in 1927, the world had irrevocably changed. In 1912, the discussion was almost all about ship-to-shore communication. By 1927, the world had tube transmitters, amplitude voice modulation, higher frequencies, and what the 1993 IARU President Richard Baldwin Whiskey 1 Romeo uniform calls literally an explosion in the use of the radio frequency spectrum. In 1927, individual countries were beginning to control the use of spectrum, but there was no universal coordination, no international radio regulation, and as we all know, radio waves don't stop at the border. Richard Whiskey 1 Romeo uniform, writing in 1993, says, quote, "In retrospect, the Washington Conference of 1927 was a remarkable effort. It created the framework of international radio regulation that exists even today. It had to recognize and provide for a multitude of radio services, including the amateur service. It was at this conference that amateur radio was, for the first time, internationally recognized and defined. Bands of harmonically related frequencies were allocated to the various radio services, including the amateur service." End quote. While the IARU was 2 years old, it really hadn't represented amateur radio on the international stage. Until now. The 1927 conference defined an amateur as a duly authorized person interested in radio-electric practice with a purely personal aim and without pecuniary interest. The harmonically related frequencies that were allocated to the amateur service are recognizable today. I'll use current band names to give you some context. 1715 kHz to 2 MHz or 160 meters. 3.5 to 4 MHz or 80 meters. 7 to 7.3 MHz or 40 meters. 14 to 14.4 MHz or 20 meters. 28 to 30 MHz or 10 meters. And 56 to 60 MHz or 6 meters. Of those, the 20-meter and 80-meter bands were exclusive to amateurs. The 10-meter and 6-meter bands were shared with experimenters, and the 160-meter and 80-meter bands were shared with fixed and mobile services. You'll notice the absence of bands we use today. The 2-meter and 70-centimeter bands, 15 meters, and the so-called WARC bands, to name a few. The final ratified document goes into great detail about the requirements, the restrictions, how to deal with interference, how to allocate frequencies, and numerous other provisions, many of which will look familiar almost 100 years later, if you've ever looked at the rules and regulations under which you operate as a licensed amateur today. There were various radio amateurs at the 1927 conference, but, as Richard Whiskey 1 Romeo Uniform puts it, quote, much of the credit for the success of amateur radio at that conference has to go to two representatives of ARRL, Hiram Percy Maxim, president of ARRL, and Kenneth B. Warner, secretary and general manager of ARRL, end quote. While Richard points to their roles in the ARRL, you might recall that Hiram was elected international president of the IARU, and Kenneth its international secretary-treasurer. Whichever way you look at it, whichever organisation you credit, today we have amateur bands thanks to those efforts made nearly a century ago. I'm Ono, Victor Kilo 6, Foxtrot Lima, Alpha Bravo.
We pause for stations along the network to identify. We are This Week in Amateur Radio, available as a stream to your favorite digital device on Spotify, TuneIn.com, Overcast, iHeartMedia, and wherever you download your podcasts.
A former engineer for Honeywell is suing the company over what he calls the military potential of an antenna design he developed while employed there. A Minnesota engineer who developed a composite material to increase antenna efficiency is suing his former employer, which had once widely praised his patented creation as a breakthrough. The design by Christopher Fuller, KD0WMU, facilitates speedier charging of electric vehicles through the use of considerably smaller antennas. Christopher's antenna design delivers the needed power as electromagnetic energy over long distances and without loss. According to a report on the Star Tribune website, a Honeywell International executive hailed Fuller at the time as being the inventor of the next multi-industry disruptor. Acknowledging that his antenna design also held the potential to power military weapons from a distance, Christopher asked the U.S. State Department last year to scrutinize Honeywell's plan to market the technology to overseas commercial customers. According to the Star Tribune story, the engineer worried that Honeywell was potentially overstepping the federal restrictions on exporting U.S. military technology and was minimizing the weapons potential aspect of the product. Neither the State Department nor the FBI responded to the Star Tribune's request for comment. A statement from Honeywell dismissed Christopher's claims as baseless, adding that Honeywell International complies with U.S. export rules and regulations. Christopher quit his job at Honeywell earlier this year, citing intolerable work conditions that followed the inquiries he made to federal officials about the company's overseas plans for the antenna design. He is now suing Honeywell under the state's Whistleblower Act. That law was created to protect workers from suffering consequences of reporting employer conduct that they believe to be unlawful.
The CQ Amateur Radio Hall of Fame was established in January of 2001 to recognize those who have made major contributions to amateur radio as a whole and radio amateurs who have made major contributions to society at large. The 2024 inductees are Joachim Kraft, DL8HCZ/CT1HZE. An enthusiastic amateur radio operator since 1980, he has been committed to the technical development of amateur radio and research into propagation phenomena in the VHF, UHF, and microwave bands since 1989 by publishing the English-language magazine DUBUS with a team of specialist authors from all over the world working on a voluntary basis. In particular, this magazine researches and analyzes DX successes on the 6-meter, 2-meter, and higher bands. The evaluation of and statistics on sporadic DX QSOs in the 2-meter band, which Joachim painstakingly compiles and updates annually, spans 50-plus years and is probably unique worldwide. DUBUS was founded in 1972 by a group of radio amateurs from Berlin and was already being used to exchange technical and DX information across all national borders at the time of the Iron Curtain. For over 35 years, Joachim has been involved in this magazine together with other radio amateurs, and for almost a quarter of a century he has been its publisher. Today it is read in over 50 countries. And next we have Tim Duffy, K3LR. Already a member of the CQ Contest Hall of Fame since 2006, he is being inducted into the CQ Amateur Radio Hall of Fame because of his lifetime achievements that far transcend his contesting accomplishments. As a contester, Tim has hosted over 160 different amateur radio operations from around the world to his superstation, which has 11 operating positions and 14 towers since 1992. He has been the moderator of the Hamvention Antenna Forum for 36 years and has served as chairman of Contest University for 15 years, the Dayton Contest Dinner for 29 years, and the Top Band Dinner. He also coordinates the Contest Super Suite for the past 37 years in Dayton during the yearly Hamvention. He also founded the popular RFI Reflector and has moderated it since 1999. Tim serves on the board of directors of the Worldwide Radio Operators Foundation as chairman and is president emeritus of the Radio Club of America. Tim is a multi-year president of the Mercer County Amateur Radio Club. He received the RCA Barry Goldwater Amateur Radio Award in 2010, Hamvention Amateur of the Year in 2015, and the YASME Excellence Award in 2016. Professionally, Tim is the Chief Executive Officer of DX Engineering. And finally, Richard A. Ross, silent key, K2MGA. He was president of CQ Publishing. He was editor and then publisher of CQ Magazine, and at one time published 11 magazine titles as well as books, calendars, and an extensive video library. Dick was also a huge supporter of contesting, DXing, and many other aspects of the amateur radio service. He believes strongly in celebrating his fellow amateurs for their exemplary achievements in these endeavors. He has now been inducted into all 3 of the CQ Halls of Fame in recognition of his lifelong dedication to the amateur radio service and to his fellow amateurs. May his legacy live on forever in our minds and hearts.
The 2024 ARRL Kids Day event will take place on June 15th and June 22nd and 23rd. Kids Day is designed to give on-the-air experience to young people and foster interest in getting a license of their own. It is also intended to give older hams a chance to share their station and love for amateur radio with the children in their lives. Kids Day always runs from 1800 UTC through 2359 UTC, and you can operate as much or as little as you like. The suggested frequencies for Kids Day are 10 meters, 28.350 to 28.400 megahertz, 12 meters, 24.960 to 24.980 megahertz, 15 meters, 21.360 to 21.400 megahertz, 17 meters, 18.140 to 18.145 megahertz, 20 meters, 14.270 to 14.300 megahertz, 40 meters, 7.270 to 7.290 megahertz, and 80 meters, 3.740 to 3.940 megahertz. You can also use your favorite local repeater with permission of the repeater's sponsor. Be sure to observe third-party restrictions when making DX QSOs. All participants are eligible to receive a colorful certificate. You can download this certificate and complete it with the participant's name and date of contact. Search Kids Day on the League's webpage for more information.
On Wednesday, May 20th of 1925, the South African Radio League was formed just a month after the world's radio amateurs met in Paris to form the world body, the International Amateur Radio Union. The word relay was dropped in 1947. The SARRL Council is already busy with planning for the centenary celebrations in May of 2025. 99 years of service to the radio amateurs of South Africa. Happy birthday to South African Radio League.
AMSAT had a major presence at Hamvention with booths devoted to teaching satellite basics, membership recruitment, the AMSAT store, engineering, education, and the Ambassador Program. Traffic was heavy on Friday morning, May 17th, as soon as Hamvention opened its doors. While some came directly to the AMSAT booth with their questions or to make purchases at the store, many other Ham attendees were attracted by the displays as they wandered through the several Hamvention venues. Volunteer members of the AMSAT engineering team were on hand to show off models of the Golf T and Fox Plus satellites currently under construction. Engineering team members also discussed various projects that are part of the Ascent program, developing possible components for future satellites. At the education booth, CubeSat Sim models were transmitting actual telemetry and slow-scan TV data across the table, demonstrating how these tools can be assembled and used in classrooms and other settings to provide hands-on instruction in satellite basics. At the beginner's corner, experienced satellite operators answered questions and helped the curious to understand how easy and exciting it is to get started in this fascinating aspect of the amateur radio hobby. Rain on Friday morning prevented live satellite demonstrations, but these took place as satellite passes and Hamvention circumstances permitted on Saturday and Sunday. The 16th annual joint AMSAT and Tapper banquet was held on Friday evening at the Kohler Presidential Banquet Center in Kettering, Ohio, just south of Dayton. This year's banquet speaker was Bill Reed, NX5R, AMSAT PacSat project manager, who highlighted the forthcoming PacSat digital communications payload. This payload is drawing on lessons learned from previous digital satellites to provide smoother operations for users in the future. The AMSAT Forum was held on Saturday afternoon. Robert Bankston, KE4AL, AMSAT president, highlighted recent activities within AMSAT and discussed some of our challenges, accomplishments, projects, and late-breaking news. Jerry Buxton, N0JY, AMSAT Vice President for Engineering, provided a video status update about upcoming satellite missions currently in development. Alan Johnston, KU2Y, AMSAT Vice President Education Relations, spoke about opportunities for using the AMSAT CubeSat simulator in educational settings. Drew Glassbrenner, KO4MA, Vice President Operations, briefed those attending on the status of current satellites. Frank Karnauskas, N1UW, Vice President of AMSAT Development, reported on the AMSAT Youth Initiative and its features. AMSAT President Robert Baxton, KE4AL, announced this week at the Hamvention that the 2024 AMSAT Symposium will be held October 25th through the 27th, 2024, at the Doubletree by Hilton Tampa Rocky Point Waterfront in Tampa, Florida. Attendance was steady at all AMSAT exhibits throughout the Hamvention weekend, and satellite operators enjoyed meeting face-to-face the voices and call signs encountered on the satellites.
You're listening to This Week in Amateur Radio, available worldwide as a podcast from our web at www.twiar.net.
In what may shape up as a first test of a new FCC rule about direct-to-cellular satellite services, a service provider has charged Starlink satellites with creating interference on the S-band. Omnispace, which has plans for building a global mobile network through a satellite constellation, has criticized Starlink satellites' own direct-to-device network for creating what a top executive calls a noise floor that renders their own customer services useless. According to a report on the Space.com website, SpaceX had previously written to Omnispace and the FCC about coordinating the frequencies of their respective system, but that exchange had not yet taken place. SpaceX's David Goldman asked Omnispace's Mindell de la Torre in early May to provide empirical evidence of the claimed interference. Goldman also questioned whether Omnispace may not be coordinating frequencies as required by the International Telecommunications Union or the FCC, because it's a licensee based out of Papua New Guinea. After launching a handful of Starlink satellites with experimental direct-to-device payloads, SpaceX has ramped up the deployment of satellites with payloads intended to communicate directly with unmodified mobile phones. 2 Falcon 9 launches from California on May 10th and May 14th each carried 13 satellites with direct-to-device payloads, part of 20 Starlink satellites launched overall on each mission. Omnispace has plans for a constellation of more than 600 satellites, but currently only operates a few experimental satellites in low and medium Earth orbits. The reported interference could be part of a test of new FCC regulations adopted in March about direct-to-device satellite services called Supplemental Coverage from Space, or SCS, by allocations, like Omnispace's MSS assignment. Omnispace said at the time they were encouraged by the FCC's decision to make SCS a secondary service, but remained concerned about potential interference. In March, the FCC adopted regulations covering so-called supplemental coverage from space, under which direct-to-device satellite services are considered secondary to primary frequency allocations on the 2 GHz band.
The International Amateur Radio Union, or IARU, has re-elected Timothy Elam, VE6SH/G4HUA, as president, and elected Thomas Reed, DFTOO, as vice president. Both will serve 5-year terms that began May 9, 2024. Elam begins his 4th term as president. Reed has been active in IARU matters for several years and has managed the Deutscher Amateur Radio Club International Affairs team since 2009. The International Amateur Radio Union is the worldwide federation of national amateur radio organizations. The membership of the IARU consists of more than 160 member societies in as many countries and separate territories. ARRL is the International Amateur Radio Union International Secretariat.
Hamvention General Chairman Jim Storms is proud to announce that the 2024 event had a record-setting official attendance of 35,877. We thank everyone that attended and hope you had a wonderful time. Friday morning's rain appeared to not put a damper on attendance. Saturday and Sunday's weather was outstanding. There was a lot of activity all across the event. People attended from all around the world and others from close by. You are the ones why we work to provide this event. Hopefully, you found the equipment, hardware, software, or forums you desired. Again, I want to thank my hard-working committee chairs and their assistant chairs, along with the approximately 700 volunteers. There are several functions that occur before and after the show. However, a large numbers work. Much more than that. In some cases, they work so much that they do not have a chance to see much of the event. I am especially appreciative of those efforts. We thank the American Radio Relay League for holding their national convention in conjunction with this year's Hamvention.
The 2024 ARRL National Convention included a track of forums featuring a variety of engaging topics of interest to amateur radio operators. If you didn't make it into the packed house of Forum Room 3 during the 3 short days of Dayton Hamvention, or perhaps you did and would like to see the material again, the content is available on the ARRL Headquarters YouTube channel. A playlist of many of the ARRL forums is available. The programs were professionally produced in HD and feature topics such as the ARRL Membership Forum, 5 Steps to a Successful POTA Activation, Ground is a Myth, Beyond Repeaters, See How Far Your Technician Class License Can Take You, and much more. The content and programming is just too good to not share with ARRL members who couldn't make it to Hamvention, said ARRL Public Relations and Outreach Manager Sierra Harrop, W5DX. There's something for every interest and experience level. I learned a lot while we were recording them. I hope our fellow hams find the playlist to be a valuable reference for years to come, she said.
The Honorable Clifford Ahrens, K0CA, passed away on May 22, 2024. He served as Vice Director and Director of the ARRL Midwest Division. He was a life member of ARRL and the Hannibal Amateur Radio Club and held an extra-class amateur radio license. In 1991, Ahrens was appointed by then-Missouri Governor John Ashcroft to the Missouri Court of Appeals for the Eastern District, where he also served 1 term as Chief Judge. Longtime friend and current ARRL Midwest Director Arthur Sigelbaum, K0AIZ, said Aaron's death is a great loss for amateur radio. He was kind, always available to give advice, and was proud of the hobby, said Sigelbaum. Former ARRL Midwest Division Vice Director Roderick Bloxham, K0DAS, first met Aarons in early 2000. Being a judge, he was very deliberate about considering all of the issues and applying decisions with a high degree of integrity, said Bloxham. Services for Aarons were held on Friday, May 31st at the Holy Family Church in Hannibal, Missouri.
A former scout camp facility outside Joplin, Missouri, that recently became a camping site for a variety of community groups, has just undergone another transformation, this time into a QTH for amateur radio. The 175 acres comprising Camp Childress has a pool, a climate-controlled dining hall, hiking trails, a trout pond, and now a ham shack. Formerly owned by the Ozark Trails Council of the Scouting Organization, the nonprofit camp welcomes community groups, athletic groups, church groups, and organizations for the disabled, and if any of them have radio amateurs among their ranks, they can enjoy some on-the-air time as well as the great outdoors. The Joplin Amateur Radio Club recently donated radio equipment and a tower to Camp Childress using club funds and a grant from the ARRL. It took no time at all for the station to get camping hams into the spirit. Club President Rex Chambers, WA0UPB, told the Four States homepage that the station's first day in the air added contacts with Florida, Montana, and Portugal to the logbook. In fact, Portugal was the first contact made, and hopefully the first of many, many more.
Here is a couple of unclassified amateur radio news stories from all over. First are the congratulations to Carlos Alberto Santamaria, CO2JC, the IARU Region 2 Emergency Communications Coordinator. The Meteorologist Society of Cuba has presented him with the Carlos Manuel Gonzalez Ramirez Award for his years of work of overseeing radio response to hurricanes and earthquakes and coordinating emergency frequency use. The award is named for the popular late TV meteorologist who died last year. And what's almost as good as going back to Youth on the Air Camp, a reunion among former Yoda campers in Region 2 who have shared the amateur radio adventures and recreational activities at the nonprofit camp for youth between the ages of 15 and 25. They will be joining former campmates at the first Yoda camper reunion taking place in June. This time, no travel plans or hotel reservations will be needed, as this will be a virtual reunion happening over Zoom. Campers are deciding between Saturday, June 8th, Sunday, June 9th, Saturday, June 15th, or Sunday, June 16th via the virtual voting system. Meanwhile, this year's campers are getting ready for their own Youth on the Air experience, which will take place in July in Halifax, Nova Scotia.
Now celebrating our 25th year keeping the amateur radio community around the world informed, you are listening to This Week in Amateur Radio, available worldwide as a podcast from our web at twiar.net.
CW operators in New Zealand are warming up for a winter straight key night. Hams are going back to the roots of CW operating with the help of the New Zealand Morse Code Telegraph Key Directory. On the second Sunday in June, they're dusting off their keys for winter straight key night, taking place on 80 meters between 8 and 9 p.m. local time. The band is expected to light up with operators calling SKN or CQ-SKN. This event isn't about the number of contacts made. It places importance on the quality of the code being sent. The Best Fist Award will be given to one operator who receives the most nominations from others participating in Straight Key Night. The award bears the name of the well-known CN operator, Bruce Scahill, ZL1BWG, who became a silent key in December of 2022. Neither logs nor summary sheets are necessary, just a willingness to pay tribute to CW, as always.
As Tropical Cyclone Ramal battered India and Bangladesh, A team of 27 amateur radio operators from West Bengal worked around the clock to keep the lines of communications open in a region overtaken by lost power and flooding. By Sunday night, the West Bengal Radio Club responded to requests by local authorities to set up at various strategic locations in and around the Sagar Islands on Sundarbans. Operators used 2 mobile vans and 8 control rooms communicating on VHF and UHF frequencies. According to updates the amateurs posted on their Facebook page, the van patrolled the coastal areas, reporting back with updates to the control centers. According to the BBC, the deadly storm was estimated to have affected millions in the coastal region of the 2 nations, and the death toll estimates varied but continued to decline. Authorities rushed to have people evacuated as their homes collapsed around them. At its peak, the storm achieved maximum speeds of between 110 and 120 kilometers per hour, with gusts of as much as 135 kilometers per hour. It was the region's first major cyclone of the year.
Federal Communications Commission Chair Jessica Rosenworcel proposed new rules May 29th to cover the risk of debris-generating accidental explosions in space. The new rules would require applicants to assess and limit the probability of accidental explosions to less than 1 in 1,000 for each satellite they submit for approval. The probability metric is derived from NASA's standard and would apply during and after the completion of mission operations. Currently, FCC rules only require satellite licensees to affirm they have effectively mitigated the risk of debris-generating explosions in space. While such explosions are very rare, Rosenworcel said incorporating a specific probability metric would support ongoing efforts to modernize FCC orbital debris rules to keep pace with increasingly crowded orbits. We can no longer afford to launch new satellites into our skies without being thoughtful about space sustainability, she said in a statement. Our orbital debris mitigation efforts will help preserve the orbital environment to protect services we rely on and allow new services to be launched. If approved by a majority of the FCC's 5 commissioners, the new requirement would be phased in 1 year after its publication in the Federal Register. It would then apply to applications filed after or still pending when the rules go into effect.
And finally this week, ham radio operators who are driving in Pennsylvania, USA, are to be exempted after all from a new distracted driving law following outcry from amateurs that a previous version of the proposed law lacked protection for them. An exemption for hams had been stripped out of the language during the legislative process, but according to news reports, it was recently restored. Following the bill's passage by the state's House of Representatives, it was expected to be sent to the governor, who is to sign it into law. And talking of going mobile and operating, if you think you can't operate mobile CW unless you have a radio and unless you also know the code, think again. Some automobiles on the market are making mobile CW operating easier than ever. It seems that in the last few years, operating mobile CW hasn't even required an amateur radio license, or so it seems. If you look, the car makers have embraced Morse code as an automotive design element. In the summer of 2022, models of Jeep vehicles featured the DIT and DA across the front grille. Jeep's Dubai-based ad agency, Policies Dubai, explained that by sporting these CW symbols up front, Jeep owners could feel a sense of community and a spirit of adventure in remote off-road places. This bold gesture followed a more subtle use of CW by the same car maker 4 years earlier. The 2018 Jeep Compass featured code on the driver's left footrest in a message spelling out sand, snow, rivers, rocks, all familiar Jeep uncharted terrain. Not to be left behind in the off-road CW dust, Hyundai has recently put 4 illuminated dits on its steering wheel, CW for the letter H. The code began appearing in new models such as the Santa Fe, the Kona, and Hyundai's electric SUV, the Ioniq. Now the Toyota Tacoma is getting into the CW traffic jam. This year's SUV has Morse code symbols appear on a side panel on the dashboard. The code provides directions to a way in which car owners can find plans to build their own 3D printed automotive accessories.
This Week in Amateur Radio is holding open auditions for news anchors for the weekly national worldwide amateur radio news service. If you have a good radio voice and can reliably read provided news copy, we are looking for you. This, of course, is an all-volunteer position. An amateur radio license is not required. You must have a high-quality microphone, headset mics are not used, and be familiar with audio editing software to record and edit your finished news stories before uploading. If you would like to try out for a weekly or bi-weekly anchor position with North America's premier amateur radio news on air and podcast, please send an email to our producer, George, W2XBS. You can include a sample MP3 of yourself reading news copy sent as an attachment to W2XBS77@gmail.com. That's whiskey, the number 2, X-ray Bravo Sierra 77@gmail.com. Be sure and use Anchor Audition in the subject line. Please include your phone number and a good window of time for a callback to discuss your submission and our operating logistics to see if This Week in Amateur Radio is a good fit for you. We hope to hear from you soon. This Week in Amateur Radio is heard around the world on nets and great repeater systems like our newest affiliates, the K2IWR repeater on 147.180 MHz in Cortland, New York, and the K2MST repeater on 443.150 MHz serving all of Syracuse, New York. We welcome them aboard the vast This Week in Amateur Radio network of repeaters and nets around the world. If your net or repeater carries This Week in Amateur Radio, why not let us know about it, and we'll give you a free promo here on the air. All you need to do is put all the details into an email and give us the repeater call sign, frequency, area served, and the days and times that you carry This Week in Amateur Radio, and send it off in an email to w2xbs77@gmail.com. We'd be happy to hear from you. That address, once again, is w2xbs77@gmail.com. We hope to hear from you real soon. Many of the news and information items heard in this edition of This Week in Amateur Radio have been provided by the American Radio Relay League, the ARRL Audio News Service, and the ARRL Letter, AMSAT, the Radio Amateurs of Canada, the Shortwave Listening Post, the Federal Communications Commission, the Radio Society of Great Britain, and Ofcom, the South African Radio League, the International Amateur Radio Union, the Wireless Institute of Australia and the Australian Communications and Media Authority, the New Zealand Association of Radio Transmitters, the Amateur Radio Newsline, the Rain Hamcast, Eric Guth, 4Z1UG and QSO Today, QRZ.com, the International Telecommunications Union, the 425DX News, Parks on the Air, and the Soda Reflector, and various news sources on the Internet.
With special thanks to all our weekly news sources and to you, our listeners, that wraps up this edition of This Week in Amateur Radio. If you'd like to write to us, you can find everything you need, including archive editions of the news service, at our website at twiar.net. And now, for all of us at This Week in Amateur Radio headquarters and our news team around the world, this is Chris Perrine, KB2FAF, wishing you a 73.